A studio hired a writer whose name was Poison, then printed that name on the screen anyway. A star fired his director after a week. A 30-year-old genius took over and spent his life pretending he had nothing to do with it. And a sitting president walked past a picket line to buy a ticket. This is Spartacus, the 1960 epic produced by and starring Kirk Douglas, directed by Stanley Kubrick and written by Dalton Trumbo. It cost more than the studio that made it was worth. Today we count down 20 reasons this film broke Hollywood, and stick around for number 1, the moment the whole rotten system cracked. Subscribe and comment your favorite Kubrick film. Let's get into it. The single most important creative decision behind Spartacus was not artistic. It was a grudge. Kirk Douglas desperately wanted the title role in Ben-Hur, the enormous Roman epic then being assembled at MGM, and he went after it hard. Director William Wyler was not interested. Wyler wanted Charlton Heston, and Heston got the part. As a consolation, Douglas was offered the role of Messala, the villain, the man who loses. Douglas refused outright, unwilling to play second fiddle in someone else's spectacle, so he decided to build his own. Douglas has been remarkably candid about the pettiness of it, admitting in later years that the entire motivation was to show Wyler up, to prove he could mount a Roman epic that matched the one he had been shut out of. He has described the impulse as a childish sort of "I will show them" reaction. That grudge produced a film that won 4 Academy Awards, became the highest grossing picture in Universal's history to that point, and helped end one of the ugliest chapters in American cultural life. Hollywood has rarely gotten so much out of one bruised ego. Douglas was not the only person in Hollywood who had noticed that the story of a slave revolt against Rome made for excellent spectacle. As his production geared up, a competing project was already in motion at United Artists, developed around Yul Brynner, one of the biggest stars alive at the time, with Anthony Quinn also attached. The rival production had a serious tactical advantage. It had already secured the trademarks on the obvious titles, both Spartacus and The Gladiators, meaning Douglas was racing to make a film he might not even be able to name. 2 competing Roman epics chasing the same historical figure at the same moment was a genuine threat to both, and the industry fully expected one of them to collapse. The Brynner version eventually fell apart, but the pressure of that race shaped Douglas's production from the beginning, pushing him to move fast, spend big, and lock down talent aggressively. The film that broke Hollywood very nearly never got to use its own title. Long before Dalton Trumbo's name became the controversy, the book underneath the film was already an outlaw. Spartacus was written by Howard Fast, a novelist who had been jailed for contempt of Congress for refusing to cooperate with the era's investigations into communism in the film industry and the arts. When Fast finished his novel, no publishing house in America would touch it. He was, in the most literal commercial sense, untouchable, so Fast published it himself. He put the book out through his own means in 1951 because the established industry had closed ranks against him, and it went on to sell substantially anyway. That is the material Kirk Douglas chose to option, a blacklisted novel by a blacklisted author, which he then handed to a blacklisted screenwriter. Every single foundational layer of Spartacus was built out of people and property that official Hollywood had formally declared unemployable. The film was an act of defiance before a single frame was exposed. Universal had one firm condition when it agreed to back this enormously expensive production. Douglas had to hire a seasoned professional who understood how to control a schedule and a budget, because the operation would involve an enormous workforce, reportedly running to more than 10,000 people. Douglas aimed high first and approached David Lean, fresh from the bridge on the River Kwai and arguably the finest large-scale filmmaker alive. Lean turned him down. The job went instead to Anthony Mann, a highly respected craftsman best known for a superb run of westerns with James Stewart. The first week, shot on location in Death Valley, standing in for the Roman mines, went beautifully. The footage was spectacular. Then the production moved back to Hollywood and, by most accounts, everything collapsed. Mann had bonded with Peter Ustinov and allowed him to improvise and steal scenes. And when Laurence Olivier and Charles Lawton, both experienced directors themselves, saw what was happening, they revolted. Arguments erupted openly on set until the whole production ground to a halt. Douglas fired Mann on roughly a day's notice. Here's the detail that lingers. By Ustinov's own account, the opening sequence in the mines is the only footage Mann shot that survives in the finished film. Watch the first minutes of Spartacus and you're watching a different director's movie. Douglas justified the firing by claiming Mann had seemed frightened by the sheer scope of the picture, which is a difficult claim to sustain given what happened next. Within a year, Mann was directing El Cid, and he followed it with the fall of the Roman Empire, two of the largest epics of the era. He was not scared of scale. He was simply the wrong man for a set that had already declared war on itself. Douglas later admitted he regretted the firing and years afterward accepted a role in the Heroes of Telemark on the specific condition that Anthony Mann be hired to direct it, a quiet apology delivered a decade late. With his production in freefall, Douglas turned to a young filmmaker he had worked with on the anti-war drama Paths of Glory, a relatively unproven talent named Stanley Kubrick, then just 30 years old. It was an extraordinary gamble, handing the most expensive film in the studio's history to a director barely out of his 20s. The gamble worked commercially and failed personally. Spartacus holds a unique and rather painful distinction in Kubrick's filmography. It is the only film he ever directed where he did not have complete artistic control, and he spent decades distancing himself from it. He did not disown it in every sense, but he made clear it did not represent his vision, since he had been hired as a gun for hire on someone else's picture rather than functioning as its author. The experience marked him permanently. After Spartacus, Stanley Kubrick never again made a film without total control over every element, a policy that produced 2001, A Clockwork Orange, and The Shining. The most disciplined creative dictatorship in film history was forged by one bad job. The core of Kubrick's misery was simple. He was not permitted to touch the screenplay. Dalton Trumbo, brought in personally by Douglas and functioning with the producer's full backing, effectively had more authority over the direction of Spartacus than its own director did. Kubrick was expected to shoot pages he had no power to change. He did not hide his contempt. Kubrick reportedly regarded the script as saddled with what he called stupid moralizing, finding its speeches earnest and preachy in exactly the way his own sensibility recoiled from. It is a genuinely fascinating collision. Trumbo was writing a passionate political statement about human dignity and collective resistance, forged out of his own persecution. Kubrick was a cold, ironic formalist who distrusted uplift on principle. Both men were working on the same film at the same time toward completely incompatible ends, and the tension between Trumbo's beating heart and Kubrick's clinical eye is arguably why Spartacus still works. The film's warmth and its chill are two men fighting inside one movie. Kubrick was not even the only person fighting Trumbo over meaning. Kirk Douglas, a committed Zionist, reportedly wanted the slave revolt to echo the history of the Jewish people, reading Spartacus as a story about a persecuted nation fighting for a homeland. Trumbo had no interest in that. He wanted the film to speak to the present, to the Cold War, to the machinery of political repression he had personally been ground up by. So the screenplay was being pulled in three directions at once by three men who each wanted it to mean something different, which is a genuinely astonishing way to make the most expensive film in a studio's history. The atmosphere on set was so tense that it produced one genuinely poignant story about the young director's insecurity. Kubrick was 30, commanding a set populated by Laurence Olivier, Charles Laughton, and Peter Ustinov, three of the most formidable talents in the English-speaking theater, two of whom had directed films themselves and none of whom had any particular reason to defer to him. According to producer James B. Harris, Kubrick kept noticing the three of them huddled together, whispering, convinced they were gossiping about him, sniping at the inexperienced kid the studio had put in charge. Kubrick eventually leaned in close enough to hear what they were actually saying. They were not talking about him at all. Each of the three was simply muttering his own lines aloud, over and over, rehearsing to himself. It is a small, human moment that captures the whole production in miniature. A young director so out of his depth that he mistook three old pros doing their homework for a conspiracy against him. The script was not merely contested between the writer and the director. The cast attacked it too. Kirk Douglas, Laurence Olivier, Charles Laughton, and Peter Ustinov all reportedly submitted their own rewrites, each attempting to strengthen his own character's material. A few survived into the finished film. Most were thrown out, which did nothing to improve relations among a cast that jostled constantly for position throughout the shoot. One rewrite battle produced real results. Charles Laughton flatly rejected the material written for his scenes, refusing to perform the script as delivered. Rather than let the standoff kill the sequences, Peter Ustinov simply rewrote the Laughton scenes himself, tailoring the exchanges between his slave trader Batiatus and Laughton's cunning senator Gracchus until Laughton would agree to play them. The results are widely regarded as among the sharpest, wittiest passages in the entire film. Ustinov went on to win the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, the only acting Oscar the film received, for scenes he had substantially written himself. The hostility on this production was not the polite, simmering kind. Charles Laughton, deeply unhappy throughout, reportedly threatened to sue Kirk Douglas on multiple separate occasions during filming, not once as a flash of temper, but repeatedly as an ongoing feature of the shoot. None of the threats ever materialize into an actual lawsuit, and Douglas, for his part, appears to have concluded that Lawton was simply behaving like a prima donna and largely refused to be moved by it. But consider what that means practically. The producer and star of the most expensive film in the studio's history was spending his working days being threatened with legal action by one of his own celebrated cast members, while simultaneously managing a fired director, a hostile replacement, a blacklisted writer, and a script everyone wanted to rewrite. Douglas has said plainly that he had an unhappy time for most of the production, and this is a large part of why. He was also recasting his female lead on the fly. Douglas had searched exhaustively for his Varinia and settled on a German actress named Sabina Bethmann, but once shooting began under Kubrick, it was decided she was not right for the part. Douglas simply picked up the phone and called Gene Simmons, who had been considered earlier, and was at her ranch in Arizona having just finished Elmer Gantry. By Simmons' own cheerful account, Douglas told her to get herself out to Los Angeles, and she did immediately. The film's emotional center was cast in a phone call, mid-crisis. Here is perhaps the most deliciously absurd fact in the entire history of this film. Russell Meddy was the veteran cinematographer assigned to Spartacus, and he found Kubrick's approach to the camera intolerable. Kubrick, a former professional photographer with total confidence in his own eye, micromanaged the lighting and framing to a degree that left Meddy with almost nothing to do. Meddy essentially walked, disengaging from the production in protest at being overruled on his own craft. His name stayed on the picture anyway, retained for contractual and legalistic convenience rather than because he was doing the work. And then the Academy Awards came around, and Russell Meddy won the Oscar for Best Cinematography for Spartacus. A man who had quit in frustration collected the industry's highest honor for images that were, by most accounts, substantially composed by the young director he could not stand working for. Kubrick, who actually shaped that look, received nothing at all. The scale of the money here is genuinely difficult to comprehend. Spartacus cost roughly $12 million, a record at the time for the most expensive film made primarily in Hollywood. The production ran to something like 167 days of principal photography, and Universal employees reportedly poured in an estimated 250,000 hours of labor across the whole operation. Now, the staggering part. While Spartacus was actually in production, Universal itself was sold to MCA. The price for the entire studio, the lot, the library, the infrastructure, the name was reportedly around $11.25 million. Sit with that. The single film being shot on the property cost more money than the entire company that owned the property was worth. Kirk Douglas was spending more on one movie than a buyer paid for all of Universal. It paid off spectacularly, as Spartacus became the biggest moneymaker in the studio's history and held that position for a decade, until Airport finally passed it in 1970. We are halfway up the rebellion, and the 10 biggest reasons are still ahead, including the censors, a dead night, and a president. If you are enjoying this, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me which epic you think has never been topped. Alright, back to Rome. There is no digital trickery anywhere in Spartacus, and nothing exposes that more powerfully than the climactic battle. To depict the terrifying precision of a Roman legion advancing in perfect formation, the production went to a vast plain outside Madrid and did the only thing available in 1960. It hired an army. Reportedly, around 8,000 serving Spanish soldiers were employed for the sequence, and the reason is beautifully practical. Extras cannot hold a legionary formation. Soldiers can. These were men who already knew how to march in disciplined ranks, hold a line under command, and move as a single mechanical organism, which is precisely the quality the scene required. What you are watching in that sequence is not actors pretending to be an army. It is a real army pretending to be a different army. That is why the formations look genuinely menacing rather than choreographed, and it is a kind of authenticity no modern production can buy at any price. The same physical commitment powers the film's other great set piece, the duel in the gladiator school between Douglas and Woody Strode's Draba, a sequence many consider the finest thing in the picture. Strode, a former athlete of extraordinary presence, gives the film its moral hinge in a role with barely any dialogue at all, choosing death rather than kill a fellow slave for the amusement of Romans. It earned him a Golden Globe nomination for Best Supporting Actor, the only such nomination of his entire career, for a performance built almost entirely out of physicality and silence. Not every production disaster on this film was political. Some were simply farcical. During the shoot, Tony Curtis and Kirk Douglas played a game of tennis together, and Curtis split his Achilles tendon. He was placed in a cast running from his heel all the way to his knee. The consequences rippled straight through the schedule of the most expensive film in Hollywood. Curtis's scenes had to be delayed outright until his leg healed, forcing an already chaotic and enormously costly production to reorganize around an injury sustained in a friendly game. There is something almost perfectly emblematic about it. Here was a film wrestling with the Blacklist, the Legion of Decency, a fired director, a mutinous cast, and a budget exceeding the value of the studio. And one of its stars was also sidelined because he and his producer decided to hit a ball around. The gladiator epic was partly derailed by tennis. The character of Antoninus, the young slave and singer of songs who becomes Spartacus's closest companion and delivers the film's devastating final duel, is one of the most emotionally important figures in the story. He is also completely fictional, and he exists in the film essentially because Tony Curtis asked nicely. Curtis was not part of the original design. By multiple accounts, he approached Kirk Douglas directly and simply asked to be in the picture, and Douglas obliged by having a role added to the script for him. That is worth restating. One of the most memorable characters in one of the most celebrated epics ever made was reverse engineered into the screenplay to accommodate a star who wanted in. The relationship between Spartacus and Antoninus carries much of the film's tenderness, and the entire thread was, in origin, a casting favor. It also gave Curtis the scene that would later ignite the film's biggest censorship war. For all the ego and warfare on this set, the commitment to authenticity ran surprisingly deep, and the most striking example comes from Laurence Olivier. While researching the Romans for his portrayal of the ruthless patrician general Crassus, Olivier discovered that Roman cavalry did not use saddles as we understand them, so Olivier decided he would not use one either. He performed his horseback scenes riding without a saddle, purely because the historical Crassus would have done so, accepting the genuine physical difficulty of controlling a horse that way, in front of a camera in full costume. It is a small detail almost no audience member would ever consciously register, but it captures something essential about why this film still holds up. Beneath all the feuding and the lawsuits and the improvised rewrites, the people making Spartacus took the world of it seriously enough to suffer for accuracy nobody would ever notice. The most notorious sequence in Spartacus is a bath scene in which Olivier's Crassus, being attended by Curtis's Antoninus, muses about whether eating snails is moral and eating oysters is not, and concludes that his own tastes include both. It is an unmistakable coded conversation about the general's sexuality, and it is remarkably bold for 1960. The censors came for it immediately. Both the Production Code Administration and the Legion of Decency objected, with the Legion demanding it be removed as obscene after it survived only a couple of test screenings. And then came one of the most gloriously silly proposals in the history of film censorship. Jeffrey Sherlock, representing the censors, reportedly suggested that everything might be resolved if the dialogue simply swapped the reference to snails and oysters for a preference between truffles and artichokes. The offer went nowhere, because of course changing the vegetables would not change the meaning. The scene was cut entirely and vanished from the film for 3 decades. It did not stop there either. The film was banned outright in some territories over its violence and sexual content, and when a re-release came around in 1967, more of the objectionable material was stripped away. Because Spartacus was long and Kubrick had no authority over it, the trimming simply continued across the years, carried out by editors with no oversight from the man who had shot it. The version of the film in circulation kept quietly shrinking, chipped at by censors and exhibitors, until by the time anyone thought to look for the original, substantial pieces of it had been ordered destroyed. The oysters and snails scene came home in the most extraordinary way. When restoration expert Robert Harris undertook a full rescue of the film in 1991, rebuilding it from color separations because the original camera negative had degraded past use, the censored footage was recovered from the studio vault, along with clips that Universal had ordered destroyed, but which somehow escaped the furnace, plus material lent by private collectors. There was one problem. The picture survived. The sound did not. The audio track for the scene had been lost, leaving silent images of 2 dead men talking. Tony Curtis, then 66 years old, cheerfully returned to a booth and redubbed his lines 3 decades on. But Laurence Olivier had died in 1989. The solution came from Olivier's widow, Joan Plowright, who mentioned that Anthony Hopkins, once Olivier's protege at the National Theatre, did an uncanny impression of him. Hopkins agreed and quietly voiced Crassus. Kubrick, still keeping his distance, reportedly faxed instructions on how the scene should be played. Watch it today, and you are hearing Hannibal Lecter impersonating a dead knight, and almost nobody notices. The rescue was a genuine technical feat beyond the voice work. Harris had to build a new 65mm preservation negative out of the original color separations, because the camera negative itself had degraded so badly that its yellow layer was no longer usable. The oysters and snails exchange is only about 2 minutes of the roughly 4 minutes the restoration added back. The rest is violence the studio had also trimmed, including a bloodier version of the death of Draba and a shot of a soldier's arm being severed in the final battle, performed by a genuine amputee. The film we can watch now is more complete than the one audiences saw in 1960. The final proof of who actually controlled Spartacus is written into its last minutes. The film ends with Spartacus dying on a cross as a martyr, while his wife Varinia holds up their newborn son, free, ensuring that his sacrifice produced something that survives him. It is stirring, redemptive, and profoundly moving, and it is the exact opposite of a Stanley Kubrick ending. Kubrick did not want it. That conclusion was imposed by Kirk Douglas over his director's objections because Douglas wanted the affirmation and Kubrick did not. Douglas had the power and used it, and the ending in the film is the producer's, not the director's. This is precisely the wound that never healed. When Kubrick spent later decades saying Spartacus did not reflect his vision, this is a large part of what he meant. The most famous emotional payoff in the movie exists because the star outranked the filmmaker. And honestly, Douglas was probably right, which may have made it worse. Now, the decision that actually broke Hollywood. Dalton Trumbo had once been among the highest paid screenwriters in the industry with an Oscar nomination to his name. Then he refused to cooperate with the congressional investigation into communism in the film business, and he became one of the Hollywood 10. For over a decade, he and the others could not work openly. Some fled the country, some took manual labor, some, as Douglas later recalled, killed themselves in despair. Trumbo kept writing brilliantly for a fraction of his old pay under invented names and borrowed fronts. Douglas hired him and then did the unthinkable. He publicly announced that Dalton Trumbo had written Spartacus and put his true name in the credits, the first time it had appeared on a screen in more than 10 years. Douglas has been open about the personal risk, saying he was warned it would brand him a communist sympathizer and end his career. The reaction was immediate. Hedda Hopper and John Wayne, two of the most powerful right-leaning figures in Hollywood, publicly condemned the film as Marxist propaganda before it was even released. Douglas also quietly hired the blacklisted actor Peter Bracco. He was not testing the water. He was kicking the door down. And the film he was making happened to contain the most perfect possible metaphor for the thing he was doing. In its most famous scene, the captured slaves are told they will all be crucified unless they identify Spartacus. Douglas stands to surrender himself, and Tony Curtis beats him to it, shouting that he is Spartacus. Then the man beside him does the same, and then another, and then the whole army, until the Romans cannot tell who is who and the naming is rendered meaningless. A film made by men who had been destroyed for refusing to name names, released while the naming of names was still official industry policy, built its climax around a crowd of people refusing to give up a name. Premiere later voted the line one of the 100 greatest in cinema, and this is the moment it all comes apart. When Spartacus opened, audiences had to walk past protesters. The American Legion organized pickets. Right-wing groups called for boycotts. The industry watched to see whether defying the blacklist would be punished. Then, in early 1961, the newly elected president of the United States went to the movies. John F. Kennedy, accompanied by his brother Robert, went to the Warner Theater in Washington, D.C. and crossed a picket line manned by the Catholic War veterans to see Spartacus. He slipped in after the film had started and sat near the back, surrounded by Secret Service agents. When the house lights came up at the end, the audience turned around and found the President of the United States standing there, putting on his coat. And by contemporary accounts, people audibly gasped. Asked what he thought, Kennedy said simply that it was a good film. That was all it took. The most powerful man in America had publicly walked past the protest and endorsed a movie written by a blacklisted communist. And the blacklist, already cracking after Otto Preminger credited Trumbo on Exodus, was finished. A grudge about Ben-Hur had ended a witch hunt. So there you have it. 20 reasons Spartacus broke Hollywood. Born from a bruised ego, adapted from a self-published outlaw novel, directed by a man who was fired and replaced by a 30-year-old who resented every minute. Its cinematographer quit and won an Oscar. Its cast threatened to sue each other. It cost more than the studio that owned it. Its boldest scene was killed by censors and resurrected 30 years later by Anthony Hopkins impersonating a dead man. And it ended with a president walking past a picket line and quietly killing the Blacklist.